We have supply and demand is what we're going to start with. So hopefully I'm not introducing anything new here, but just kind of going over it before we get into an activity, touch on what we'll do here. We'll touch on just the models, we'll talk about shifters, and then we'll also kind of look at consumer producer surplus and price ceilings and price floors. Okay, I do that because the activity I have and a lot of the activities that are in the book just kind of have some type of market. Do any of y'all do that where you have buyers and sellers and then you have a market going on? Do y'all do that in your class? So we're going to do that today. We'll go through it maybe a round or two, but do y'all take it beyond that? Beyond having them just do kind of get to this equilibrium situation, have them see what a buyer and seller does. Not yet. That's a great answer. Not yet, okay? So what I'm going to do this lesson, and you can do whatever you're already doing, just take bits and pieces from this lesson, right? If you have the market for cocoa, I'm using the market for silver. Essentially, I'm going to take it a step and have them understand consumer and producer surplus, and then which is kind of profit for producers, and then we'll take it to price ceilings and price floors. So it's this one lesson that you can kind of use in various ways depending on where you're at in your class. Okay, so that's why I chose this one to really kind of let y'all see, because most of y'all, as it appears, is doing something like this, but let's take it up a notch, okay, and let the students see it a little bit differently. So would y'all agree this is probably one of the hardest things for your students to get? Yeah, this right here is one of the hardest. So it's demand versus quantity demanded. I just pulled some of these slides from mine, and then these are some of my own definitions. So they're, don't expect them to be super textbooky here. That one is. So quantity demanded, right? And I italicize amount because when I'm talking to my students about quantity demanded, that's how I do it. It is a point on that line. I give you a price, you tell me a quantity. Okay, and that's it. Okay, when I talk about quantity demanded, that's it. Yes, we talk about that a buyer is willing, they have to want to buy it, and they have to be able, they have to have the income, buying power to do so, right? That stuff is important, but when we're stressing the difference between demand and quantity demanded is a point on that line, right? If the price is $5, right, you can tell me this person wants to buy 9 units. That's it. That's a quantity. Is that how y'all kind of do it as well? Okay. Then I go to demand, and I even flipped through a couple of textbooks, and a lot of time they don't have a definition for demand. It's demand curve or demand table or demand schedule, right? And so the way that I think about this is demand, yes, it's that line, but it's all of those price quantity combinations. So instead of I give you a price, you give me a quantity, I can give you any price, you can tell me those quantities, and then you map them out. So essentially I'm getting to that demand curve. But when we talk about a demand, you as a consumer have a demand for a good. You have a demand for that computer. You have a demand for the silver, right? So that's kind of how I introduce that concept is you have a demand for a good or service, okay? And then that consists of a whole bunch of price quantity combinations that tell me what you're willing and able to buy, okay? So it's a point versus a line. Right? And so once you start shifting this stuff, that's where it gets a little more fuzzy. But it's just really helpful to just nail that down, especially when you're introducing demand, so that when you go to supply, they already have it down. And the last part is just the law of demand. I don't know. Most of the students catch on to that. You tell them the price is going up. They don't want to buy as much. But a couple of language things here that are helpful. I always use inverse relationship, and I use kind of an inverse relationship, direct relationship. I use those terms for everything I'm talking about. So anything that moves in the opposite direction will have an inverse relationship. The same direction will have a direct relationship. Now, I say that because students sometimes get confused on supply and demand. Which one is up, which one is down? Well, if we know the law of demand has an inverse relationship, up and down, that tells me that demand curve better be downward sloping, right? And so that's a way, this curve is downward sloping because of the law of demand, okay? And I think students can, they really understand in practice the law of demand. Now let's have them take it to the graphs and really kind of see, well, then it has to be downward sloping, okay, because they go in the opposite direction. The other thing that students, I tell them, I don't know, I heard this at a workshop, I think in the past, demand goes down to the ground, supply goes up to the sky. Have y'all heard that before? I'm not going to take credit because that doesn't sound like, I don't think I could have made that up. I probably heard that somewhere. And I'll tell you, I tell my students that. I see them doing this all during the test because this is how I walk around the room and we're talking about shifting curves and that's how I talk about it. I don't know, these are just helpful tips that I've learned in the past workshops, or even some of my students have told me these, right? Sometimes we forget what it was like to be in their seat. You know, it's been quite a while since I learned this stuff. So sometimes and yeah, I'll laugh, it hasn't been that long, I guess, but it's helpful to kind of see what it's like from their perspective, okay? I knew. Okay, so next I have all the shifters here. We'll briefly just talk about them. We have the number of consumers in a market, more people, more stuff. I essentially tell them we live here in this town, right? So they all go home and then they all come back, right? So that's just kind of population changes. Then I have price of related goods. So we have substitutes and complements. Now I'll ask y'all, what if you're introducing the substitutes example in your class, or what do y'all think of? What's your classic go-to example? Coke and Pepsi. That's me too. Being from Texas, Dr. Pepper is like the biggest one there, but no. Coke and Pepsi, yes, this is good. Coffee and tea, right? I think we mentioned that one before. Some of you are like, what? Tea? What's tea? Yeah, chicken and pork, chicken and beef. Okay? Good. And then we have complements with an E. That's, if you ask me a pet peeve, that's one of them. It has to be with an E. Eyes, you look nice today. E is peanut butter and jelly. So what is y'all's example? Do y'all use that one? Peanut butter and jelly? Hamburger buns, that's good. Yep, so cars and gas, good. Okay, that's an interesting one because we could even discuss it for the other one as well. Yeah. Yes, what'd you say? Coffee and cream, right? So those are just quick, easy things. I always tell my students, pick an example. Before I even start talking about this, I give them the definition of a substitute. Or, right? Or, this or that. And then tell them to pick. So that when it comes to the test time, they aren't borrowing my example. They have an example from their life, right? I think that if we can get them to see that they're experiencing this, they will attach to it and it will just make more sense, okay? And so complements as well. Then we have consumer income, right? So this is the one where we have to talk about, you know, there are goods that are normal and there are goods that are inferior. But this is based on income, like how your income changes, what happens. So the normal one's it's like kind of everything else but the inferior ones. So if I were to say an inferior good, what goods do you typically come to mind? Or what examples do y'all use? Yeah, that's a classic one, ramen noodles. I told them once I got a job, I bought less ramen noodles, but I'll be honest, I actually still love them. Right? There's a lot of sodium, so watch out for that, but they're tasty. Okay, so ramen noodles, what else? McDonald's, yeah. I'll go to something else. The other off-brands, right? So you can even go into a discussion of name brands versus off-brands, right? So, Yeah, so just kind of this used second round market type of thing. Then we have tastes and preferences, which is like everything else. Okay, so that one's just a catch-all as well. And then we have consumers' expectations. So this could be expectations about prices. It could be expectation about income, right? So it's really just making sure they understand that's prices today versus prices tomorrow. Okay, prices tomorrow, if we know them as a consumer, will affect our behavior today. Okay. Then we go to supply, right? So there's your supply curve. Supply goes up to the sky, right? That's one thing. We have quantity supplied versus supply. Again, it's the same thing. Amounts, a point on the line, or quantity supplied is a specific quantity. I give you a price, you give me how many units that seller is willing to produce there. The supply curve represents all of them. And then we have the law of supply, has that direct relationship. Again, it's a direct relationship up and up, right? If price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. If they go down, the other goes down. So again, when we're talking about why is that supply curve upward sloping, it's all that law of supply. Okay. The other thing I'll throw in right here is that supply curve is really our cost curve. Do y'all talk about it that way with your students? Behind the supply, that's a cost curve. That's actually a marginal cost curve. Okay, that's kind of what's going on there. And so as we go, we'll talk about consumer and producer surplus, but this supply curve comes from all of the costs, right? If you were to think about this, let's go here, $3.15, right? Everything up to this point, they're not going to be willing to supply that good for that amount, right? That doesn't cover their costs, right? So if I'm at 15, if I'm trying to get this firm, they want to sell 15 units. Well, they have to pay their workers, right? They have to pay their taxes. They have to pay their rent. They have to keep the electricity on. They have to buy resources, inputs, right? So they're not even going to start to break even, kind of, roughly, that's what we're talking about, until the price is 3. Okay? In all that story, anything down here, producers aren't going to be happy about, right? That doesn't cover their costs. They're not going to be willing or able to sell their product then. They're not going to enter the market. They're not going to sell that many until that price covers all of them. Yeah, I wouldn't say greed. I would go to market power. But yeah, I mean, that you have to put the other ones together. Answer that question because that comes from demand and pricing, right? But yes, funny. Okay. Then we have those shifters. You'll notice I went super fast through that one, hoping that the demand side explanation, if you spend a lot of time and are really thorough then, this is a lot bit faster. And then we have the number of sellers, the input prices, okay? Then we have a government tax or subsidy. A lot of times I throw that one in with input, cost of inputs or cost of production. Technology, producer's price expectation. So make sure, right, we talked about expectations on the other side. Just remind your students whose viewpoint we're looking from matters, whose perspective it is, right? Consumers are going to want lower prices. Producers will want to sell theirs at the highest price. And so we have to make sure when we're looking at those price expectations, whether it's the price we're going to sell our good for or the price of an input may increase tomorrow. So how does that change our behavior today? So those are our shifters for supply. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I tried to just make this as simple as possible. And for the supply side, it really is, okay? If it's good for the firm, we're going to shift the supply to the right. If it's bad for the firm, we're going to shift the supply to the left. Demand has those substitute, complement, inferior, normal goods that kind of have all the subsets, so it's a little more difficult to say. But anything for supply side, anything that's good goes to the right. Anything that's bad goes to the left. Like wages going down, that's good for the firm, right? So supply will go up. Taxes going up, not so great. We go to the left. Okay, so it's a really just simple way to get them to think about it here. The last thing I'll say that I will say the students kind of get hung up on are the wages versus income. Do y'all see that problem sometimes in your classes? Right? Income and wages. They're like, if you think about the circular flow diagram, some of y'all mentioned that, it's right there. It's just the money going a different direction. Right? So firms see wages as a cost to production. So if wages are going up, that's bad for the firm. Right? Now, a consumer, if their wages went up, that's like their income goes up, right? Income is a demand shifter. So it's same dollars, different perspective, okay? And that's how I really remind them of that. And by the time we get there, we've already covered the circular flow diagram, and so we can clearly see those arrows going different directions, right? And so that's just one hang up that I see quite a bit. Okay, there's equilibrium. Fantastic, right? Price has reached a level where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are the same, right? And so what's the most interesting point here? Well, there is an intersection, so we might as well look at that one. That's our equilibrium. Do any of y'all use equations to kind of depict this model? Okay. No biggie. Super, it's you know, check it out if you want. I'm here. I love it. But in solving it, you use this definition. You set quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied, and bam, you get your price, right? So even if you extend it, you could just do that. The next part I will say is consumer and producer surplus. I'm going to put it all up there. Do y'all talk about this one in your class? Nope. Okay, this is an easy one that they understand. It's just, we just put a fancy word, I think. And that surplus part, again, isn't talking about a difference in quantities. A lot of books and a lot of things I've seen have this as consumer apostrophe. It's their surplus, right? And so when we talk about consumer surplus, it's the amount a buyer is willing to pay minus the price they actually have to pay. Now, when you go into a store to buy stuff, do you think like that? Before you put something in your shopping cart, are you like, okay, well, I'm willing to pay this. Here's the price. No, yes, done. Do y'all think like that? Big items, right? If I go to the grocery store, I couldn't tell you how much cheese costs. I couldn't tell you how much some of that stuff costs, right? Big items, oh yeah. Now, I'll give you an example, because you mentioned Goodwill. I think this kind of ties into it. This is the example I give to my class, because they're like, I don't do that. I don't sit down and really calculate that stuff. And I told them, oh, I was at Goodwill, or Savers, right? It took me a long time to know Savers was like Goodwill. Well, shopping for Thanksgiving decorations, right? Hosting Thanksgiving. Wanted to go buy some decorations. They had this glass pumpkin. It was great. It was perfect centerpiece for the table. Didn't have a price on it. So I got nervous. I don't like that whole interaction there if there's no price. But I know myself. Whatever price they say, I'll be like, that works. That's good. Okay, so what I did before I went up there, I said, okay, how much am I willing to pay? What price? I got to determine this price first, or I'll just say yes, no matter what they say, right? That's me. So I said, okay, $5. $5, that's it. Okay? If it's above 5, I won't buy it. If it's less, great, but 5, that's it. That's my number. So I go. That's my willingness to pay. That's my value, right? I go up, and they're like, 2. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll take it. Trying to hide as much excitement, because there you go. That's consumer surplus, right? I was willing to pay 5, but I only had to pay 2. So I got some gains, right? Gains from trade. That's one of those principles that we talk about. That's how we determine how consumers are doing, okay? Producer surplus, this is a rough measure of profit, right? This is where I said that supply curve gives us cost information. So it's the amount a seller is paid minus the cost that they had to incur to produce that good. Sounds a lot like profit, right? So how much money are they bringing in minus the cost that they had to pay? And then the total market surplus is all of that together. Okay, so we just added up consumer and producer surplus. Now, if we look at the graph here, we can kind of see what's going on. We have our supply and demand curve. And then graphically, we can just expand that normal supply and demand lesson to include consumer and producer surplus. So we have our equilibrium here. 30 is our price, quantity is 15. Now, if we think about that, willingness to pay minus price, that's our consumer surplus. Willingness to pay, that's kind of the definition of our demand curve, right? It's the maximum price consumers are willing or able to pay for a good or service. So if we think about it, this line represents our willingness to pay, and the price, well, that's what we had to pay. So consumer surplus is that whole area for all of those 15 people that got to buy the good, whatever good we're talking about here. Okay? Producer surplus, it's the other side of it, right? It's the price that the sellers are getting minus the cost, which is our supply curve. Okay? Behind, like I said, behind that demand curve are consumer preferences, utility maximization, all that good business. Behind the supply curve are costs, okay? And then if we put it all together, we get that whole triangle. That's our market surplus. That's all the gains from trade that we could experience in this market. And then the last line says this market's efficient, okay? Efficiency in this discussion is talking about welfare, okay? Welfare of buyers, welfare of sellers, and then how well off is this market doing in general. Okay, so if we say the market is efficient, that means there's nothing left on the table. Nobody can be made better off if we deviate from this equilibrium. Okay, so market surplus is maximized. There's no area that's not shaded in. So what are some examples where we wouldn't be efficient? Can y'all think of them? When we might not be able to get to this efficient result, where that last good, that 15th unit, where we have that value, right, $30 here, that is how much a buyer is willing to pay, and that's exactly how much it costs the seller to produce that good. Do y'all talk about externalities in your class? That's one of them, right? Market power, right, a monopoly. You said greed, right? If we're talking about a firm that has market power, they don't have to charge a price equal to marginal cost. It's not going to be that consumer is willing to pay 30 and the firm's like, okay, that's it. That's my cost. And that doesn't happen so often. Okay, so those are a couple of examples. Market power, externalities, those are kind of market failures, if that's kind of the language you use in your book. But anytime we're not in a perfectly competitive environment, right, where we're efficient, right, we won't be able to shade in that whole thing. And I'll show you the next ones here are price ceilings and price floors. Do y'all do this in your class? Talk about these a bit? This isn't efficient. You'll notice that the whole triangle isn't shaded in. That's how I tell them. If you can see there's a triangle, there's always a triangle left over. But a price ceiling, it's a legal maximum. Do your students get these backwards, price ceilings and price floors? Okay, struggle with this all the time. The one thing I kind of have them do is I say, I'm in a room, right? There's a ceiling. I can't go above a ceiling. I can't go below a floor. Is that how y'all explain this as well? Okay. And so I have them like, can I get to the equilibrium? Can I get there? No, the ceiling's in the way. Right? Can I get to the equilibrium? That's the question they have to ask. Can I get there? No. Okay. So if we're talking about a price ceiling, it's a legal maximum. Can I get to equilibrium? No. Okay. So in order for that one to be binding, it has to be below. Right? Because I typically draw arrows and say up and up and up. I can't get there. Okay. So that generates a shortage. Okay, and the example I have here is a rent control, right? The New York is kind of the classic one I have them think about. That there's some other locations as well. Say I think San Fran has them. So it's big kind of areas that are pretty darn expensive are going to have these types of situations. Or you could also think of housing, low-income housing. That might be another example we could think about. But you'll notice the equilibrium, this isn't the same graph I had before, but the equilibrium would be here without any intervention. With this price ceiling, we're only going over to this far. We're not getting to that original equilibrium. Do y'all see this little triangle right here? That says we're not efficient. All of those gains are not realized because we're suppressing this price. Some intervention, government intervention, is stopping us from getting to that efficient allocation for some other reason, right? Maybe this is helping out consumers, so maybe there's a different reason why we have this price control, but we're not getting to that efficient result that we talked about before. The last one that I have here is the price floor. Okay, minimum wage, your students, they totally get this one. And so we spend quite a bit of time talking about it. So if we're talking about the minimum wage, this isn't necessarily the supply and demand for goods and services. This is the labor market. So you'll notice the axes are different, right? L is just the quantity of labor. W is the price kind of labor, which is your wage. Okay, so just identify that for them because the supply curve here is a supply for labor. So is that the firm or the household? The supply of labor. That's a household, right? So that's opposite of what they thought before. So just point that out. Demand, that's a firm. They have the demand for workers is coming from firms. And then there it is, right? You can have a discussion. Right now, this is a pretty hot topic. When I introduced it this semester, it was right around where lots of debates were going on as to what that should be or will be. And so we talk about that. And of course, I have about half Minnesota, half Wisconsin students. So that's a great little rival there as the minimum wages are quite different for these two states. And so again, we see the equilibrium is here, we're over here. Okay, right? We're not getting to that efficient allocation of resources. Again, for some reason, in this example, government intervention. And so all of this would previously, that would have been consumer, that would have been producer, but it's gone. Right? And so that's why when we talk about consumer and producer surplus, then we can, I think it's one that's pretty simple and accessible for them to kind of pick up in several different places throughout the semester. And it gets them to think about their behavior a little bit differently, I think. And then in that example, it generates a labor surplus, which, what does that labor surplus represent? What does that mean in practice, a labor surplus? Unemployment, right? And so that's kind of the argument behind like raising this minimum wage. That gap just gets a little bit bigger. So make them see, right? This is the labor market. So yes, it's not necessarily the difference in goods and services. Now this is people. This is workers. Okay. So that's all you have for the intro part. I know that was a little longer, but hey, it's my section, so that's cool. Do y'all have any questions? Was that helpful to kind of just maybe get some tips on I think where students run into issues. Do y'all have any other ones that might be helpful? Yeah. So I strategically keep them separate. That's how I get around that. I say first, when we start talking about these, we are just going to talk about demand, and then we will just talk about supply, and we can't answer that question until we put them together. Because once we put them together, then we can start talking about market behavior, different market structures. But that's how I handle it, is I really try to keep them very separate and then put them together. And then after that, I answer it. Yeah, because I think once you put them together and once you start shifting them, that's really where you can see kind of this change in demand. The price will change, and then how the supply curve doesn't, but the quantity supplied will. So they can respond that way. I think that's kind of what you're getting to. So I think once you start shifting them, you can kind of say, okay, my demand increased. Well, what happened? My price changed, which then says sellers are going to respond to that change in price. But yeah, I think a lot of us, I'd say the common thing is keep them separate as long as you can, and then put them together and answer all of those questions.